I waved to Ingrid from inside that warm building.
And not one of you ever sent out coffee. Not Fianna Fáil, not Fine Gael, not Labour, nobody ever sent out coffee, just to make that point.
It's hot whiskies she needs. Anyway, in the darkest days of the Second World War, the British government and British society planned for the post-war settlement, and there was a determination not to repeat the mistakes of the 20s and 30s, and there was an aspiration to create a better society. Great plans were hatched while at the same time a life and death struggle was taking place in Europe and in the Pacific. And it is possible at times of great crisis to plan for a better future. In fact, the aspiration of getting to that future can assist in overcoming the immediate crisis. In the same month that Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, the British government set up a thing called the Interdepartmental Committee on Social Insurance and Allied Services. 18 months later, as the Soviets launched their victorious counterattack in Stalingrad, what became commonly known as the Beveridge Report was published. And that report was highly popular with the public and formed the basis for the post-war reforms of the welfare state, which included, as we all know, the expansion of the welfare state and the development of the National Health Service. And in those dark days, popular attitudes found that the report had almost universal approval by all shades and was the first real attempt to put into practice the talk of a new world. So, in the first instance, I want to take issue with the title of this talk. We need to start not with public service transformation, how and when, but actually we should start with what. We need to define what our aspirations are, and that's a task for all of society, but the role of government is crucial. Our economic and fiscal model has failed. Everybody knows that. However, part of the current demoralisation of our people is caused not just by what has happened, but by their well-founded fears that there is a deliberate and systematic plan underway to rebuild the very economic and fiscal model that failed us. That's not uniquely an Irish failing. National and international institutions seem bent on rebuilding rather than reforming the failed international financial system. Public services are a mark about how a society organises itself, as the Deputy said, how it cares for its dependents and how it plans for the future. And while we have different issues and agendas to face compared with the British in 1941, there is an opportunity, if not a requirement, to map out a vision for the public service that will exist in 5 years' time and beyond. This should involve seeking to build a shared vision and possibly a consensus on how our healthcare system will work, our childcare provision, our elderly supports, our education system, our skills and training, the role of our local authorities and state agencies, and the remit of our civil service. If we're to transform our public services, we need a set of goals and targets. We need to have a vision of the future as well as a vision for the future. Without this, transformation is at best merely tinkering. At worst, it's a much more sinister exploitation of the crisis to force through the concept of a minimalist state, which has not been the subject of proper democratic debate or decision. We've had too much tinkering in the times of the economic boom. We focused our debates on the structures of our public bodies and not on the desired outcomes. For instance, we had endless debates about the abolition of the health boards and the establishment of the HSE without focusing on what those bodies were actually required to achieve. A few years later, we're changing that again, and there's little debate about the vision of what we want. From a trade union perspective, we were sucked into a futile set of talks and negotiations on structures and not on deliverables. The result was a wasted effort. We saw plenty of change that failed to bring us nearer to the type of public service people tell us they want. One characterised by accessibility, quality, fairness and accountability. My great fear about the comprehensive spending review that's currently underway is that we will repeat that experience over the coming months. All the talk is about amalgamating bodies, abolishing bodies, merging them, assimilating them, or even allowing them to survive. Most of us accept that our loss of economic sovereignty means that the practical options ahead will mean painful cuts and reconfiguration of services. But there's too little discussion about what public services we will deliver now and after the recovery. In short, the government and the public service seems to be having an internal conversation, far distant from the immediate concerns or indeed long-term aspirations of the people. That's not to say that there shouldn't be a debate on organisational structures or service delivery models. There is an urgent need to design and refine the most efficient and cost-effective organisational models. The Croke Park Agreement facilitates that and gives the government, unions and the public an invaluable tool to deliver these outcomes in a time of crisis. But I'm suggesting we actually need to look beyond this. We need to place what we do in a context. We need to have a vision or a goal. We need to have ambitions that go beyond the need to pass the targets set by the Troika. A number of simple questions take us to the heart of a debate on our public services. What will it do? What will it look like? How will it be managed? How will it be funded? And what industrial relations framework and outcomes does it need? So dealing with what will it do? As the moratorium on public service numbers continues, it will become increasingly difficult to manage with fewer resources. It's inevitable that services will diminish. We all aspire to doing more with less, but the reality in many cases is that we will be doing less with fewer resources. That's the consequence of losing our economic sovereignty. The government and public service management need to be honest with the public instead of creating expectations that cannot be delivered or achieved. That's the world we live in until growth returns and we can, as a society, overcome our financial crisis. Nevertheless, we can and should be capable of, for instance, spelling out the type of education system we will have, the number and spread of schools, the range of subjects, the pupil-teacher ratio, the supports for those with special needs, and the funding and management of the crucial administrative supports for the efficient running of our schools. A similar approach can be taken for health or welfare, and we can and should define the functions we will assign to our local authorities. When it's complete, the comprehensive spending review will lead to significant challenges for public servants as well as the general population. It's anticipated that many spending programmes will be curtailed or eliminated. Many frontline and back office services will be shared. Some organisations will be merged, others will be abolished or altered. These expected government decisions will directly affect many staff, and the Croke Park Agreement anticipated this and expressly provides for redeployment within their geographical area or within their skill set. Nevertheless, we must resist the ideological approach of those who seek to use this crisis to bring about the minimal state. We need to draw a distinction between the cuts and retrenchments that arise because of the crisis and the range and level of services that will be restored once the crisis has passed. We've already done this for public service workers under the Croke Park Agreement, which contain provisions for the restoration of the income cuts once the crisis has abated. And I believe the same approach could and should be adopted for the general population. What the public service will look like. The Croke Park Agreement allows us to envisage and prepare to build a public service that's fit for purpose. It should be more web-based. It should have one-stop shops with integrated IT systems. It will have many shared services in the area of backup functions like payroll, HR, superannuation, information technology, and plant and machinery. There will be fewer agencies, and we should see the shape of this emerging from the spending review. It should also have a reform agenda not necessarily to save a lot of money in the short term, but to change things for the better in the long term. It should implement reforms that are long overdue and include things like the delegation of the management of budgets, modernising the method of appointment to and promotion in the public service. A question I ask: why could an engineer or an accountant become a manager in local government or in the health system, but not in the civil service? Why can't staff be promoted across streams or employments or sectors, especially as under the rules of Croke Park, if they're surplus, they can be moved across those barriers? How will the public service be managed? In the first instance, we should act on the explicit recommendation of the OECD and establish an integrated and interchangeable public service management. Predictably, this recommendation has moved into what's called a senior civil service, thereby excluding operational managers in education, health, agencies and local government. To be effective, a senior public service needs to allow for cross-stream transfers and career paths. Local authority and health managers should be able to occupy senior positions in the civil service and vice versa. Public servants who have management roles face particular responsibilities under the Croke Park environment. Many of them, to be truthful, only have experience of managing in the good times. All of them developed their careers in a culture of top-down decision-making with central control of staffing, resources and budgets. Managers will have to break out of the traditional funnel worldview. Under the pressure of the crisis, many public service managers are actually learning to live with diminished resources. And it was heartening from the point of view of the implementation body to see local initiatives with suppliers being challenged to deliver goods and services at lower costs. Organisations were grouping together for bulk purchase of energy and other supplies. But those examples only existed within individual sectors, and there's a need to broaden the horizons of public service managers and forge links across sectoral boundaries. I believe local government, with its local footprint and local decision-making, has a clear role to play in this. It must be said that there is a significant challenge facing public service managers in recognising and facing up to the new realities. Dealing with managers who fail to perform is a matter that will have to be considered in detail by the new department. And it must be said that it is not acceptable for managers to hide behind and misrepresent Croke Park. It's actually possible to conclude from a trade union perspective that some managers believe life would be much easier for them if their staff took another pay cut instead of them having to undertake the hard graft of managing with fewer resources. How will the public service be funded? Actually, the answer to this is quite simple. It will be through taxes and charges, and by the end of the EU IMF programme, it won't be funded through borrowings. As a society, we need to have a grown-up discussion and debate about how we fund our public services. For too long, we pretended we could fund our public services through windfall taxes on property transactions. Reality is dawning. We need to tax income and property. The principles of taxation should be that they're progressive, meaning the more you earn, the more you pay, and affordable, meaning that standing charges should not apply to those who can't afford them. But we will also have expenditure taxes. We will have to charge directly for some public services. And the balance between all of these is what is and should be the arena of legitimate political debate. What is not acceptable is for politicians and lobbyists, and indeed trade unionists, to oppose every proposal without proposing realistic alternatives. The last heading I want to deal with is what industrial relations framework and outcomes does it need? And trade unionists must recognise that in many cases in the public service, our unions and union structures were designed for a different era. Last year, the ICTU set up a commission on the future of the trade union movement, and in effect they said that union structures were built on opposite sides of what we'd see as Berlin walls. The civil service was a standalone entity, local government was, health was, education was, and that world will not survive. The Commission recommended that unions should recognise the fact that those walls have fallen down, and we must rebuild our union structures to cater for that. And the Impact Union is willing to engage in the consequences of that. We should also, from a practical point of view, have all public servants using the same industrial relations machinery as applies in the private sector. Everybody should use the Labour Relations Commission and the Labour Court, as opposed to some parts of the public service having their day out in front of a senior council with the strange and weird and wonderful outcomes that very often come from those quarters. We don't actually need to have all public servants on identical terms and conditions. These have grown up over generations for different reasons. But what we do require is a formula that allows for the easy transfer of staff from one employment or one sector to another. Croke Park is an agreement between an employer and its staff. I've said before, and it's worth repeating again and again, it is not a social partnership agreement. It's my judgment that it would benefit from being surrounded by the framework of some form of social partnership, which would allow the representative bodies of business, farming and the community sector to have an insight into what's happening. The trade unions are open to that. I believe the other social actors are, and it's a matter for government to decide if and how this can be developed, and I believe it should. At the very least, some form of social partnership or social dialogue will involve us missing the point and getting involved in gratuitous and ill-informed comments about what's going on. There's an understandable political nervousness about this, but I point out that recent events across the Irish Sea suggest that it's time we move beyond a public discourse and policy that's hypersensitive to the positions and adopted of newspaper editorials or media headlines. The title of this address is Transforming the Public Sector, How and When. I hope my remarks have addressed the question of how. The experience of Croke Park is that when started a year ago, but will continue for many years to come. Public service transformation has, is and will be relevant yesterday, today and tomorrow. Thank you.